The studio monitors hissed with 30 years of static before a voice emerged, brittle and shivering, with a terror so raw it seemed to vibrate the very glass of the sound booth. Logan's hand froze over the mixing console as he listened to the frantic breathing of a man who had been dead for 3 decades, describing the sound of concrete being poured over screaming men. Outside the station, the heavy crunch of gravel signaled the arrival of a black SUV, its headlights cutting through the rain like the eyes of a predator. A single bullet shattered the top pane of the studio window, showering the equipment in jagged diamonds of glass. Logan dove for the floor, pressing the canvas bag of tapes to his chest as the smell of ozone and wet earth filled the room. On the desk above him, the on-air light pulsed a rhythmic, blood-red glow, broadcasting the damning evidence to every kitchen radio and car dashboard in Blackwood Creek. The heavy thud of a shoulder hitting the reinforced door echoed through the hallway, and Logan realized that the truth didn't just set you free. It turned your neighbors into hunters. Logan McBride adjusted the collar of his worn flannel shirt, the fabric thin and rough against his neck. He stood before the smudged glass of the studio window, a barrier between his small sanctuary and the dying town of Blackwood Creek. Dust motes danced in the slanted beam of a desk lamp, illuminating rows of empty plastic chairs and the unoccupied workstations that stretched into the shadows of the far corner. The silence of the building pressed against his ears, heavy and absolute, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the computer's cooling fan. Logan moved to the mixing console, his fingers finding the familiar cold metal of the sliders. He felt the resistance of the aged faders as he set the levels, a mechanical ritual he had performed 1,000 times. On the wall, a calendar hung like a warning. A thick red circle surrounded the date marking 30 years since the Horizon mine had been shuttered. He inhaled the scent of stale coffee and ozone, his eyes fixed on the analog signal monitor. The needle flickered, a heartbeat in a room that felt like a tomb. Logan pressed his spine against the cold chain-link fence, the sharp edges of the wire snagging the tough fabric of his jacket. Above him, the skeletal remains of the Horizon mine's headframe loomed against the deepening twilight, turning into inky silhouettes that resembled the bones of some prehistoric titan. He waited, breath held, as the sweeping beam of a spotlight on the distant guard tower traced a slow arc across the perimeter before veering toward the dense woods. Once the light passed, Logan moved. His boots stepped silently onto the damp gravel, skirting past warning signs where the paint had long since peeled away into illegible flakes. The air grew thick with the smell of wet earth and oxidizing metal, a sharp, metallic tang that filled his lungs as he slipped through a jagged breach in the brickwork of the main enclosure. His heavy breathing turned to a faint mist in the chilling evening air, a ghost of his presence as he pushed deeper into the forbidden zone. He swept the narrow beam of his flashlight across the peeling walls of the administrative wing. Long strips of wallpaper hung from the ceiling like dead skin, fluttering in the draft. Concrete grit crunched beneath Logan's soles as he approached a massive oak desk. Its heavy frame slumped halfway through a rotted section of the floorboards. He reached out, his fingers probing a strange irregularity behind a layer of cracked plaster near the empty doorframe. With a grunt of exertion, Logan tore away a jagged chunk of drywall, exposing the dull metallic corner of a box embedded deep within the masonry. Dust billowed into the air, clogging his throat and forcing him to suppress a cough. He worked quickly, clearing the debris from around a heavy steel safe door that had remained hidden from the world for 3 decades, a secret buried in the literal walls of the town's ruin. Logan wedged a narrow chisel into the seam of the safe's lock and delivered a series of short, punishing strikes with a heavy pipe wrench. The metal shrieked in protest, a high-pitched wail that echoed through the hollow corridor. After several minutes of strained struggle, the door groaned and finally yielded to his efforts, swinging open on rusted hinges. Inside, Nestled among a pile of decayed ledgers lay a weathered canvas bag. It smelled of mildew and old plastic. Logan extracted the find with trembling hands, feeling the substantial weight of circular canisters within. He pulled back the zipper to reveal brown magnetic tapes wound onto reels with yellowed, curling labels. His eyes widened as he read the dates. 30 years old, scrawled in a jagged, uneven hand. These were the voices he had been looking for, cached in the very heart of the silence. The sudden, violent glare of a high-powered spotlight cut through the darkness, pinning Logan against the ruins like a specimen. A harsh shout from a Kavanaugh security mercenary was instantly drowned out by the roar of a gunshot. The bullet struck the brickwork inches above Logan's head, showering him in a fountain of red dust and grit. He ducked instinctively, clutching the precious canvas bag to his chest as more rounds whistled through the air, ricocheting off the exposed steel beams with a terrifying whine. The heavy thud of tactical boots echoed through the empty hall, accompanied by the clipped, mechanical barks of radio commands. Logan's heart hammered against his ribs, his senses overwhelmed by the smell of cordite and ancient dust. He lunged toward a side exit, moving while the second Kavanaugh shooter paused to reload. He leapt over a tangle of corroded pipes, the sound of bullets striking metal clanging behind him like a rhythmic hammer. A rusted iron ladder shivered under his weight as Logan scrambled toward the second tier of the loading terminal, his hands gripping railings that were slick with old oil and grime. Below, the flashlight beams of the pursuers hunted across the walls, cutting off the primary exits. But Logan dove into a narrow technical crawl space. His knees barked against the sharp edges of the ventilation ducting, and his palms burned from the friction against cold cast iron. He slid down a steep embankment of crushed stone at the far end, nearly losing his footing before vanishing into the deep, welcoming shadows of the ancient hemlocks. The shouts of the mercenaries began to fade into the distance as Logan tore through the thorny underbrush, heading for the safety of the forest's edge. Logan hauled himself into the cab of his old pickup and wrenched the key in the ignition. The engine turned over with a violent roar, a mechanical growl that felt like a triumph. Gravel sprayed from beneath the tires as he tore onto the rutted dirt road leading back toward Blackwood Creek. In the rearview mirror, the blinding xenon headlights of the security SUVs appeared, rapidly closing the gap between them. The steering wheel jerked in his grip as the truck hit deep potholes, the entire frame shuddering with every impact on the suspension. Logan mashed the accelerator into the floorboards, ignoring the protesting scream of the transmission. Wind whipped through the cracked window, biting his face with a sharp chill, while the shadows of the trees blurred into a continuous gray streak along the margins of the dark road. Logan yanked the wheel hard, swerving the pickup into a narrow alleyway between the brick warehouses on the outskirts of town. The tires shrieked on the wet asphalt as he doused his headlights and killed the engine, coasting into the deep shadows of an old depot archway. The heavy SUVs of his pursuers thundered past on the main road, their engines a receding roar that left the night silent. Logan waited, his pulse slowing as he listened to the rain drumming against the roof of the cab. Once certain the road was clear, he eased out of the shadows and navigated a series of back alleys toward the rear entrance of the radio station. He leaped from the truck, the bag tucked firmly under his arm, and took the fire escape stairs 3 at a time. He slammed the heavy, soundproof door of the studio and threw the deadbolt, the metallic click sounding like a finality. His fingers were visibly shaking as he pulled the first reel from the bag and mounted it onto the tape deck spindle. Logan carefully threaded the thin magnetic ribbon through the guides and the pressure roller, securing the end to the take-up reel. A profound silence descended upon the room, broken only by his ragged breathing and the sharp snap of power switches. He hovered his hand over the play button, a single bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. His gaze was locked on the brown film of the tape. A physical reservoir of secrets that he was about to unleash upon a town that had spent 30 years trying to forget. Logan pressed the button. The studio monitors responded with a low hum, followed by the characteristic hiss of vintage tape. Through a crackle of static, a raspy voice emerged. The shift master, his tone brittle with a primal, naked terror. Logan froze as the man on the recording began to describe concrete sarcophagi hidden in the lower levels of the Horizon mine. The words, "deliberate collapse," sent a chill racing across Logan's skin, his fingers clenching the edge of the console until his knuckles turned white. The voice on the tape broke into a desperate cry, listing the names of those left alive in the sealed-off tunnels to cover up a massive chemical leak. A sickening cold spread through Logan's veins as he realized the magnitude of the crime he was now witnessing. With a sharp, decisive motion, Logan shoved the master broadcast fader to the top. The signal level indicators jumped into the red, pulsing with life. He leaned into the microphone, his voice steady despite the adrenaline, announcing an emergency broadcast to the sleeping residents of Blackwood Creek. He flipped the toggle to patch the tape deck directly into the transmitter. The sounds of horror and the damning revelations of the dead began to climb the radio tower, radiating out into the night sky. On his monitor, the listener count began to spike, numbers climbing at a frantic pace. The town, long buried in its own silence, was suddenly filled with the voice of a dead man. Logan leaned back in his chair, the weight of the truth finally out of his hands and into the airwaves. Logan leaned forward, his lips nearly brushing the speaker as the tape continued to play. The engineer's dry, hacking cough punctuated the recording, followed by a clinical recitation of technical terms: cesium, sulfates, half-life periods. The voice detailed how lead-lined containers had been entombed in the concrete footings of the 4th level, disguised as structural supports for the ore carts. Logan watched the voltmeter needle twitch in rhythm with the descriptions of forged anthracite production reports. Every depth and coordinate mentioned felt like a physical thud in the room, echoing the hollowed-out geometry of the earth beneath the town. His fingers gripped a pencil, scrawling chemical symbols and map coordinates onto a notepad, documenting the slow-motion bomb that had been planted under their feet. The massive oak door of the station didn't just open. It exploded inward, the stop bracket groaning as the wood slammed against the wall. Sheriff Miller stormed into the control room, bringing with him the suffocating stench of cheap tobacco and wet wool. Without a word, Miller's broad hand swiped a ceramic mug off the desk, sending a spray of cold coffee across the floor and over Logan's boots. The sheriff loomed over the console, his jaw thrust forward, his heavy breathing fogging the glass of the studio microphone. Miller's face was a deep, mottled purple as he jabbed a thick finger toward the spinning reels. He demanded the tape be torn from the machine immediately, his presence so aggressive that Logan could feel the heat of the man's rage radiating against his skin. Miller closed the remaining distance, pinning Logan against a rack of vinyl records. The cold metal of the sheriff's badge pressed into Logan's chin as the officer dropped his voice to a predatory whisper. He began to hiss out details about Logan's late father, bank accounts and monthly checks issued by the Horizon Corporation. Logan saw the dilated pupils of a man who was protecting his own skin. The revelation of his father's complicity hit Logan harder than any physical blow, the air escaping his lungs in a sharp gasp. Miller sneered, enjoying the way the confidence bled from Logan's eyes. The family secret was a leash, and Miller was pulling it tight, watching Logan realize that his crusade for the truth started with his own bloodline. Logan pushed through the station's front door and stopped dead on the porch. His Ford sat in the middle of the parking lot, looking crippled. All 4 tires had been slashed into ribbons of black rubber, the rims resting directly on the gray asphalt. He walked slowly toward the vehicle, his eyes catching a mark on the windshield. A bullseye had been drawn in thick red marker directly over the driver's side. A crosshair centered as if a phantom marksman were already tracking his head. The wind whistled through a torn wiper blade. Logan ran a finger along the deep, clean cut in the tire's sidewall. The smell of scorched rubber and the creeping sensation of being watched from the dark windows of the surrounding buildings made the hair on his neck stand up. The sound of metal grinding against metal screamed through the air as the heavy prow of a black SUV slammed into the left fender of Logan's truck. The narrow bridge over the Blackwood River shuddered under the impact. Logan felt the steering wheel snap against his wrists, nearly breaking his grip. Icy spray from a ruptured radiator coated the windshield, obscuring the view of the churning gray water 10 meters below. In his mirror, Logan could see nothing but the opaque tint of the pursuer's glass. The SUV backed off and lunged again, a deliberate ram intended to force him over the low guardrail. His tires shrieked on the bridge's expansion joints. Logan threw his weight against the door as a final, violent impact shattered the side window, showering him in glass. At the threshold of his home, Ellen stood waiting. She gripped the handles of 2 leather suitcases so hard her knuckles were white. Her gaze searched Logan's face, lingering on the fresh, jagged scrape across his forehead. She spoke in a frantic, breathless rush, pleading with him to kill the transmitter and burn the tapes for the sake of their safety. The smell of a domestic dinner, something she must have started before the panic set in, felt alien and wrong in the face of her ultimatum. Logan saw her lower lip tremble as she described the anonymous phone calls, the voices promising fire and blood. He reached out to touch her hand, but she recoiled, stepping back into the shadows of the hallway as if he were already a stranger. The metallic ring of keys hitting the hardwood floor sounded like a gunshot in the silent living room. Ellen turned her back and walked out into the night, her silhouette brief against the porch light. She didn't look back. Logan stood frozen in the doorway, listening to the heavy thud of a car door and the aggressive whine of tires on the gravel driveway. The house suddenly felt cavernous, occupied only by the rhythmic tick of the wall clock and the low hum of the kitchen refrigerator. He looked down at the abandoned keyring, where a small radio-shaped charm lay against the floorboards. The silence was a physical weight, pressing in on him as the shadows of bare tree branches crawled across the walls like skeletal fingers. Logan stepped through the automatic doors of the local supermarket, and the ambient hum of the town's morning chatter died instantly. Old Mrs. Green yanked her cart around so sharply she nearly toppled a display of canned peas, her eyes fixed on the floor to avoid his gaze. He placed a carton of milk on the conveyor belt, but the cashier simply stopped, crossing her arms and staring at a point somewhere over Logan's shoulder. The hum of the refrigeration units seemed to grow louder in the absence of human sound. Logan saw the naked hostility in the eyes of his neighbors, a cold, collective wall of silence. He left the milk on the belt and walked out, the back of his neck prickling under the weight of 100 accusing glares. Logan sifted through a stack of official envelopes on his desk. The logos of the town's largest gas stations and hardware stores were all there, but each letter was stamped with a formal notice of contract termination. His email inbox was a graveyard of advertising accounts, with notice after notice of ceased payments turning the station's budget into a black hole. He stared at the red deficit numbers on the screen, knowing the power company would be the next to call. His fingers trailed over the buttons of the soundboard, the equipment that had defined his life now feeling like a burden he could no longer afford to carry. The bitter taste of bile rose in his throat as he realized how efficiently the town's pocketbook could be used as a noose. The first stone tore through the studio's panoramic window, transforming the glass into a cascading sheet of diamonds that peppered the carpet at Logan's feet. From the street below, a dull roar of voices rose, punctuated by the rhythmic clatter of more projectiles. A second rock smashed the desk lamp, plunging the room into shadow. Logan scrambled for sheets of plywood and a hammer, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the night chill poured through the broken pane. Nails bent under his shaking hands, the sound of his hammering drowned out by the screams of the mob outside. Through the gaps in the wood, he saw the distorted, angry faces of people he had known for years. Plaster dust settled in his hair as he frantically boarded up his last refuge. The needles on the radio station's output meters began to vibrate with a frantic, rhythmic intensity, even though no sound was playing through the monitors. Logan felt a pulsing, low-frequency thrum rise from the floorboards. A vibration so deep it made the teeth in his head ache. A sudden, blinding spike of pain shot through his left eye, forcing him to double over and clutch his temples. The wave seemed to originate from the direction of the Horizon mine. A subsonic roar that brought a metallic taste to his tongue and a wave of nausea to his gut. He watched the computer monitors dissolve into a chaotic mess of static and rolling lines. The migraine pulse felt like a rhythmic hammer, synchronized with the groaning of the earth itself. Logan pressed his eye to a narrow gap in the plywood, watching the activity in the parking lot. The harsh beams of the Kavanaugh SUVs cut through the swirling fog, illuminating men in tactical gear with assault rifles slung over their shoulders. They moved with a mechanical precision, setting up interlocking metal barriers to seal off every exit and approach to the station. Logan watched as one of the guards adjusted a tripod, mounting a long-range acoustic device aimed directly at the studio. They weren't there to talk. They were there to contain a contagion. He could see the cold professionalism in their movements, a stark contrast to the chaotic rage of the townspeople who lingered at the edges of the perimeter, waiting for the walls to come down. Logan brought the heavy hammer down on the head of the final nail, driving the steel deep into the thick crossbeam. The dull thud of wood on wood was swallowed by a sudden, violent crack of thunder that made the entire building shudder. Outside, a wall of rain slammed into the roof, turning the dust on the boarded-up windows into thick, muddy streaks. He could feel the vibration of the downpour through the rafters, a frantic drumming that resonated in his palms. The air in the narrow entryway grew heavy with the smell of wet pine and hot metal as he tossed the hammer aside. The nailhead disappeared into the grain, sealing the heavy door against the storm and the shadows that waited beyond it. He dropped to his knees in front of the portable generator, yanking the starter cord until the engine coughed into life, spitting out a cloud of blue exhaust and the sharp scent of gasoline. His fingertips came away slick with grease as he carefully mounted the final reel onto the spindle of the tape deck. The red marker on the label had bled into the tape, but the names of the city council members remained legible, a roster of the damned. He flipped the power toggle, and the indicator light glowed a dim, sickly orange in the shadows of the control room. The magnetic tape went taut, ready to pull the names of the traitors through the playback heads, exposing the signatures that had rotted in the damp dark of the Horizon mine for 30 years. Logan leaned against the glass just as a jagged bolt of lightning tore the sky open. In the brief, strobe-like glare, he caught the unmistakable silhouette of Ellen inside a yellow taxi. Her face looked like a wax carving behind the fogged window as the car began to pull away from the curb. At that exact moment, the saturated slope of the mountain behind the station gave way. A torrent of mud, boulders, and uprooted pines roared down across the highway with the sound of a freight train. Logan watched in horror as the landslide obliterated the road, cutting off the taxi's path and interring the highway under a massive brown wall of debris, effectively severing his last connection to the woman he loved. A sudden, violent screech of metal biting into wood made Logan bolt back from the door. The blade of a heavy felling axe bit through the lower panel, spraying splinters across his boots. Through the jagged hole, he heard the ragged breathing of the local butcher, his voice a guttural snarl punctuated by the calm, professional commands of the Kavanaugh mercenaries. Logan saw the glint of steel in the breach and heard the heavy slide of tactical boots on the rain-slicked porch. Every strike of the axe felt like a punch to his own chest, a rhythmic destruction of his perimeter. He backed toward the mixing console, the barricade of beams groaning and splintering under the pressure of the mob and the killers. Logan gripped the talkback button, the familiar hiss of an open channel filling his headphones. His voice came out like sandpaper as he began to read the first list of names from the recovered documents. He spoke the names of the mayor, the local judges, and the town treasurer, his words flying out into the storm on a frequency that couldn't be ignored. His throat felt like it was filled with glass. But he didn't stop, detailing the exact dates and times the orders had been signed to flood the lower levels while men were still inside. Every name he spoke was a strike against the town's foundation, a public flaying of the men who had built their mansions on top of a mass grave. On the grainy security monitors, Logan watched a glass bottle shatter against the front door, splashing a plume of orange flame across the wood. The liquid fire took hold instantly, licking at the dry paint of the facade, and thick coils of black smoke began to curl through the cracks in the doorframe. He watched as the townspeople, egged on by the Kavanaugh team, hurled more Molotovs at the building. The heat from the porch began to radiate through the walls, making the air in the studio shimmer with a distorted haze. Through the cameras, he saw the faces of his neighbors, twisted by the firelight into something demonic, their rage fueled by the very truth he was trying to tell them. The floor beneath Logan's feet lurched violently, and the heavy concrete slab of the foundation split with a sound like a gunshot. He grabbed the edge of the console to keep from falling as the entire building tilted toward the mountainside. A crack the width of a man's hand snaked across the floor, swallowing cables and the legs of a rolling chair. A draft of ancient, salt-tinged air rose from the fissure, smelling of stagnant water and old earth. The deep, tectonic shift from the mine below made him feel small, a flea on the back of a waking beast. The walls of the studio began to warp, and he heard the structural rivets in the ceiling pop one by one under the immense strain. Logan froze as his own voice was suddenly cut off by a deafening, low-frequency howl. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was a rhythmic, pulsing vibration born from the resonance of the hollowed-out earth beneath Blackwood Creek. He ripped the headphones off his head, his ears ringing with a pressure that felt like it would burst his skull. The electromagnetic field in the room spiked so sharply that the hair on his arms stood straight up. The howl sounded like the collective scream of 1,000 buried voices, amplified by the very transmitter he was using. He watched the speaker cones flex to their breaking point, vibrating with the agony of the earth itself as it began to collapse. The front door finally splintered into pieces, and Sheriff Miller burst into the smoke-filled room, followed by 2 mercenaries. Logan didn't hesitate. He ripped a heavy steel microphone stand from its base, gripping the cold metal like a club. Miller raised his service weapon, but the swirling black smoke made it impossible to find a clear shot. Logan lunged forward, swinging the heavy stand in a wide arc, the movement illuminated by the blue sparks of short-circuiting wires above. The mercenaries raised their rifles, but Logan dove behind a rack of heavy server equipment, using the massive steel cabinets as a shield in the cramped, suffocating space of the burning control room. Logan slammed his shoulder into Miller's chest, the impact sending both men crashing to the floor among the broken glass. They rolled through a tangle of power cables, and Logan felt the jagged shards of the window bite into his palms. Miller drove a sharp elbow into Logan's jaw, the taste of copper filling Logan's mouth as blood sprayed across the sheriff's uniform. Around them, the damaged power mains were throwing off arcs of blue electricity, lighting the room in frantic, terrifying strobes. Logan gripped Miller's wrist. pinning the man's gun hand to the floor as they struggled in the heat. The smell of burning hair and ozone was overwhelming. A frantic battle for survival in the heart of a collapsing world. A heavy rifle butt slammed into the back of Logan's head, and the world dissolved into a smear of white light and pain. He fell to his knees, blood slicking the back of his neck, but his hand found the red emergency broadcast button on the floor-mounted panel. He slammed his palm down on the plastic, locking the transmitter into a high-gain loop that would burn out the local grid. In the next heartbeat, Miller's hands were around his throat, squeezing with a desperate, murderous strength. Logan thrashed, his vision darkening as he looked into the sheriff's bloodshot eyes. But he forced a bloody grin. The signal was out. The names were in the air, and no amount of fire could take them back now. Through the gray haze of his failing vision, Logan saw the studio walls begin to disintegrate. A flash of lightning revealed the brickwork buckling inward as the ground beneath the station finally gave way. A blast of freezing air, smelling of deep stone and wet minerals, roared up through the floor, clearing the smoke for a brief, terrifying second. He felt the chill of the mine's breath in his lungs, a cold that felt like a mercy against the heat of the fire. The ceiling above him and Miller began to sag, the roof peeling away to reveal the black, churning sky. Logan closed his eyes as the roar of the mountain finally drowned out the screams of the living, the earth claiming its due. A blinding blue arc of electricity tore through the control room as lightning struck the radio tower's main mast. The surge traveled down the lines with a sharp, explosive crack, and the mixing console erupted in a shower of white sparks. The smell of fried circuitry and ozone became a physical weight in the air. Before Logan's eyes, the plastic reels of the tape deck began to warp and melt, the heat from the electrical fire turning them into black, distorted lumps. The magnetic tape, the only physical record of the dead men's voices, caught fire, shriveling into a sticky, smoking residue that coated the spindles. The evidence was being erased by the very storm that had heralded its release, leaving nothing but ash and silence. The sound of splintering timber above him was the only warning Logan got. A massive flaming support beam groaned and dropped from the ceiling, pinning Sheriff Miller to the floor with a sickening crunch. The man's scream was cut short by the weight of the debris and the sudden collapse of the brickwork behind him. Logan didn't wait to see if he was dead. He rolled away from the heat, his hands finding the freezing metal handle of the emergency exit. The door was jammed by the shifting foundation, but he threw his entire weight against it, his shoulders screaming in protest. With a final, desperate heave, the door gave way, and he tumbled out into the freezing mud and rain just as the rest of the studio roof caved in. Logan scrambled away from the building, collapsing onto the wet grass of the rear lot. He coughed violently, spitting out gray ash and soot as the rain soaked through his shirt. He turned to look back and saw the station shuddering like a dying animal. The walls were folding inward, collapsing into the basement in a roar of fire and falling masonry. A vortex of sparks and red-hot embers shot into the night sky, only to be extinguished by the torrential downpour. The place where he had spent the last decade of his life was now nothing more than a smoking pyre, a pile of blackened bricks and twisted metal glowing in the dark. The Kavanaugh mercenaries and the sheriff's deputies were backing away from the edge of a massive sinkhole that was opening where the parking lot used to be. The ground beneath the ruins of the station was simply vanishing, revealing the black, yawning void of the Horizon Mine's upper levels. Logan watched as a guard tripped and scrambled toward a waiting SUV, his face pale with a terror that surpassed professional discipline. The tactical teams scrambled into their vehicles as the earth itself began to moan, a deep, tectonic sound of settling rock. The headlights of the departing Jeepy bounced wildly through the trees as the pursuers fled the growing abyss, leaving Logan alone with the sound of the rain and the crumbling earth. Logan limped toward his pickup, which sat precariously near the edge of the forest. His fingers, caked in soot and grease, fumbled under the driver's seat until they brushed against a thick, cardboard texture. He pulled out a heavy folder, held together by a thick rubber band. The backup copies of the documents he had smuggled out before the mob arrived. Rain lashed against the plastic cover, but the pages inside remained dry and crisp. He clutched the folder to his chest, the weight of the paper a small comfort against the cold. It was the only thing he had left, a paper trail that the fire hadn't reached. He threw it onto the passenger seat and climbed into the cab, his body shaking with a sudden, violent chill. He pushed open the door to the local diner, the bell above the entrance ringing with a lonely, tinny sound. The smell of grease and old tobacco was the same as it had always been, but the atmosphere changed the moment he stepped into the light. The waitress stopped mid-pour, her eyes tracking to a point on the wall behind him, her face a blank mask. At the counter, a row of men he had known since childhood suddenly became very interested in their coffee. The silence was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. He walked toward the counter, but the cook reached out and slammed the sliding metal partition shut. Logan stood in the center of the room, a ghost in his own town. Realizing that they had already decided he no longer existed, Logan stopped in front of his neighbor's house, hoping for a single word of recognition from the old man who was clearing his mailbox. At the sight of Logan, the man dropped his mail and scrambled for the porch without looking back. The heavy wooden shutters of the house slammed shut with a series of sharp, rhythmic thuds, and the click of the deadbolt was audible even from the sidewalk. Logan watched as the lights in the houses all down the street began to go out, one by one, leaving him standing in the dark. The town was erasing him, closing its eyes and its doors until he was nothing more than a shadow on the pavement. The wind kicked up, swirling dead leaves around his boots in the empty street. He stood at the lip of the massive crater where the Horizon Mine's headworks had once stood. The hole was a jagged, ugly wound in the earth, filled with churning mud and the twisted remains of the steel elevators. Logan watched as a final section of cable slid into the muck, vanishing into the black water that was filling the void. The mountain had closed its mouth, burying the chemical vats, the forged reports, and the bodies of the abandoned miners under millions of tons of unstable rock. Any physical proof of what had happened in those tunnels was now a mile underground, sealed away by a landslide that no shovel could clear. He stared into the fog-choked depths, knowing the truth was now a matter of faith rather than evidence. Logan tossed his heavy tool bag and a stack of framed, cracked photos into the back of the pickup. His house felt like a hollow shell, the rooms echoing with the sound of the wind through the broken windows. He walked out onto the porch and ran his hand over the doorframe, feeling the small notches he had carved there years ago. Across the street, not a single curtain moved. No one came out to shout or to say goodbye. He turned the key in the lock for the last time, knowing the house was no longer his. He climbed into the cab and started the engine, the sound of the motor the only thing breaking the silence of the dead-end street. He didn't look at the rearview mirror as he pulled away. The tires of the truck hummed as they crossed the line where the maintained asphalt ended and the highway began. Logan caught a final glimpse of the rusted "Welcome to Blackwood Creek" sign in his side mirror, the metal pitted with bullet holes and age. The sign faded into the morning mist, becoming a gray blur against the trees. He watched the silhouettes of the mountains recede, the peaks that had defined his world now shrinking into the distance. The dawn light was a cold, hard silver, illuminating the road ahead as it stretched toward the horizon. Blackwood Creek was shrinking into a memory, a place of secrets and silence that he was finally leaving behind. His foot heavy on the pedal as the forest gave way to the open road. Logan pulled the truck onto the gravel shoulder and killed the engine, letting the silence of the deep woods wash over him. He reached out and turned the dial on the truck's radio, moving past the static of local stations and the distant chatter of morning talk shows. He found the frequency where his station used to be. It was a flat, featureless hiss of white noise. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the seat, listening to the rhythmic crackle of atmospheric interference. Amidst the chaos of the static, he thought he heard a pulse, a rhythmic thrumming that sounded like a heartbeat or a distant, muffled shout. He sat perfectly still, his breath shallow, trying to catch the ghost of a signal from a world that had tried to bury him alive. He gripped the steering wheel, the leather cold against his palms, and felt the tremors in his hands finally begin to subside. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, where the highway merged into the interstate that led toward the coast and a world that didn't know his name. Logan mashed the accelerator, and the pickup surged forward with a roar that felt like a release. The last of the night's shadows fled from the cab as he picked up speed, the needle on the speedometer climbing steadily. The past was a weight he was finally dropping, the road ahead a blank slate. He drove into the rising sun, the sound of the wind through the vents the only voice he had to listen to now.